This week on our Wonderful Day in the Lord broadcast, we're looking at the coming of Christ. We started by looking at the first coming, at the incarnation, and then we looked yesterday at what often is called the rapture because the words in 1 Thessalonians 4 speaks of, one of the words is caught up, which is Latin, means rapture, and so the children of God, the church will be caught up to be with the Lord and go to be with Him. But so this is, perhaps some might call it the first stage of the second coming. But there's two different events that take place, and we believe it takes place 7 years apart. The rapture takes place when the Lord calls His church to be with Him, and we go to be with Him forever. But there does come a day, and it is prophesied in the Old Testament. It's prophesied by Jesus Himself, and also by the epistles. There is a day coming when the Lord Himself comes back to the earth and sets up His kingdom on earth. Jesus talked about that in Matthew chapter 24. And I want to look at verses 27 on down with you. He's talking in chapter 24 at what we call the Olivet Discourse, in which He is talking about the future and God's plans for this planet and for His people and for the world in the future at the coming of Christ. And He talks about the tribulation period that leads up to the coming of Christ. But the actual return of the Lord takes place starting in verse 27. And so here's what Jesus has to say about that. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. And so He's speaking of this coming of Christ like lightning coming across the sky. And so it's going to be, I think it's going to be very bold. It's going to be very obvious. The world's going to know it. The world's going to see it. Christ is coming. Wherever the corpse is, there will the vultures gather. Verse 29, now we get the details. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, so at the end of the tribulation period that is described in the book of Revelation, also the book of Daniel, after those days the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. So we have this catastrophic events taking place throughout the world and throughout the universe at the second coming of Christ. This is not going to be a hidden thing. The world's going to know and see, and we'll look at that more tomorrow, but it's going to be a big event. Nobody's going to be able to say, well, that didn't happen. Verse 30, and then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. So the world will see. This is actually, verse 30, a quote from Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10. So this is prophetic. This is something God has promised long ago would happen, and Jesus is simply reiterating this truth. So the world's going to see this at this time. And in verse 31, and He'll send forth His angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together His elect from the four winds from one end of the sky to the other. And that's Zechariah chapter 14 and verse 5 in that particular passage. I'm going to actually go back to Zechariah chapter 14. Here is another description of what takes place on the day Jesus returns. Behold, a day is coming for the Lord, when the spoil taken from you will be divided among you. And I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be captured, and the houses plundered, the women ravished, and half the city exiled. But the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city. I meant exiled on that. I confused myself. The city will be exiled. Verse 3, then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as when He fights against on the day of battle. In that day, He says, His feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which is in the front of the Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives will be split in the middle from east to west by a very large valley, so that half of the mountain will move towards the north and the other half towards the south. You will flee by the valley of my mountains, for the valley of the mountains will reach Azel. Yes, you will flee just as you fled before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with Him. There's a powerful picture of Christ coming back. And it's a picture of when Jerusalem itself is surrounded by enemies, when the world is trying to destroy Israel once again in Jerusalem, and the Lord comes in rescue. And so part of this return of Christ is definitely has to do with Israel and the protection of God's people, and then setting up his kingdom on earth when that follows. So we're going to look at that more next week, especially in the book of Revelation. And I want to show you the difference between what we call the rapture and what we're seeing here as the actual second coming of Christ when he actually comes to the earth. So I hope you can join us tomorrow.